Good morning. I am Ryan Lucas. I'd like to start by thanking Rod for inviting me today. Where are you, Rod? Over there. So I reached out to Rod at the start of the year just to say g'day and to ask if he knew of any other paediatricians interested in low-carb medicine. He didn't. And so I got an invitation to talk. So that's just a warning to anyone thinking about reaching out to Rod. So I'm not going to be talking about Kawasaki disease today. I'm a general paediatrician, but I work exclusively in developmental and behavioural paediatrics. I split my time 50-50 between private rooms in some of the leafier suburbs of Sydney, but I also work as a staff specialist in community paediatrics in some of the most disadvantaged communities in Western Sydney, where I take referrals, usually for kids who are struggling at school. They might have a range of issues, and I get referrals from schools as well. And I'll be talking about one of those kids today. Today I'm going to be talking about applying some of the principles of low-carb medicine in paediatrics. I'll be reviewing some biochemistry and gesturing to some articles from the literature that I find useful. Now, I want to say from the get-go that I have cherry-picked those articles. And the reason I've done that is because the literature is complex, because nutritional science is complex. So I will be talking about what I think are important articles in the space, but I'm not making the claim that that the evidence is unanimous or clear. Now, disclosures, none. No one has ever paid me to say anything. I'm going to start with a case, but first, is anyone in the room familiar with the Cynefin framework? No? Great. So the Cynefin framework is a way of conceptualising situations and systems based on increasing levels of complexity. So in the bottom right corner here, we've got clear systems. That's where the relationship between cause and effect is obvious to everyone. And these are situations where best practice makes sense, where you can just follow a guideline and things will work, okay? I don't work in that space. The top right space is a complicated system. In a complicated system, the relationship between cause and effect isn't obvious, but through analysis and the application of expert knowledge, it can be understood. And this is the space of good practice. So there's not one way of doing things. There are a number of ways, but they proceed logically. And I think this is where a lot of doctors practice. And I spend some time in this space, but I spend most of my time in the complex space. In the complex space, the relationships between cause and effect are only able to be appreciated in retrospect, and that's because the different variables are deeply entangled. You can't apply best practice or evidence-based guidelines in this space. It's too complex, and you can't simply understand these systems by looking at them for longer and getting more data. The way to work in this space is to probe the system and see what happens, and then continue to move in the direction that you're aiming for. And then there's the chaotic space, and this is the space where the system is actually in flux over time, and so you can't really come to understand it, and you've just got to act to settle the system down. So I want to pitch my talk today from the context of clinical and socio-cultural complexity for two reasons. Firstly, that's the space in which I work, but also because I want to push back against simplistic narratives, because they don't work. They're not applicable to the cases that I work with. So the case I'm going to present is certainly within this complex space. It's not a real case, but it's an amalgamation of my real cases. While the case itself is not a real case, all of the numbers are real. And this is not an unusual case. I think every paediatrician has cases like this. This is common stuff. So let's look at this referral. This is very typical of a referral I would get from a school. So, dear doctor, please see Marley, 6-year-old girl in year 1. She's working below expectations and requires one-to-one support to complete all classroom tasks. She struggles to regulate her emotions and has not managed to make any friends. Finally, she soils herself several times a week and seems to lack an age-appropriate awareness of personal hygiene. Sincerely, the principal. So I'm going to meet Marley. And we get a bit more information. Marley's one of 5 kids. There's a single-parent household and there's a background of domestic violence. They're in public housing and the house is too small for a family of 6. Mum gets carer's allowance for the eldest son who has an intellectual disability and autism. Mum's overweight and had gestational diabetes with the last 3 of her pregnancies. Okay? Bit more past medical history for Marley. She was born at term by caesarean section. She was a bit big and had some transient low sugar. She occasionally gets some viruses and wheezes a bit. She snores loudly every night. She's not a picky eater at all. In fact, you can see that most of the food groups are represented here. On examination, Marley's 6. She weighs 56.6 kilos, and that's central adiposity. Her height is 139.8 centimetres. Her BMI is 28.2. I'm going to put that in context in a minute. It's not up here, but she's also hypertensive. She's got big tonsils, blue ear on the right, bit of a wheeze. She's got this thing called acanthosis nigricans, which I'll show you in a minute. She's got knock knees and she's got head lice. Getting complex enough? So these are the growth charts. You can see that Marley's weight, her weight is well above the 97th centile. So is her height. And that's her BMI. So that represents a BMI where we don't talk in centiles. She's nearly 3 standard deviations above the mean. That's acanthosis nigricans. It's darkening of the skin in the axilla and often around the neck. And there are a few things that cause it, but by far the most common is insulin resistance. So we do some blood tests. This is the full blood count, looks pretty good, nothing's red. This is the electrolytes and liver function test. We've got some red things. The alkaline phosphatase is a little bit up, but she's growing, probably just reflects skeletal growth. The gamma GT is up, but it's 21. The reference range is 5 to 20. No one cares. We don't care unless they're at least 2 times the upper limit of normal, right? The ALT is 33, the upper limit of normal is 30. Again, who cares? And her cholesterol is low. Yeah, pretty normal. Yeah, vitamin D's down a little bit, not too much. Iron's okay, and thyroid's okay. So we did some fasting glucose, and the fasting glucose is really good. And the HbA1c was in the normal range, so everything's looking good. Except that her fasting insulin is 38. And ignore that reference range. Below it says that a fasting insulin on the Abbott architect method of between 10 and 14 is suggestive of insulin resistance. So she's well above that. And just keep in mind this is a fasting insulin. And so this is essentially as low as this girl's insulin ever gets. So let's go back and look at those blood tests, and let's just be a little bit inquisitive about how normal those liver functions are, if we do an ultrasound, we actually find that she has a moderate fatty liver. So I want to be unequivocal on this point. This kid is sick. So to summarise the issues, she's got school difficulties, quite a few. She has socioeconomic disadvantage and an unclear history of developmental trauma that may be multi-generational. She has a family history of neurodevelopmental disorders. She has obesity, insulin resistance, and fatty liver. She has sleep-disordered breathing, eustachian tube dysfunction, and head lice. I think all of these fall within my domain. But what's causing what? What is the direction of causality here? This is complex, okay? So let's just put a pin in that. I'm going to talk a little bit about obesity. I say obesity, but I mean obesity and metabolic ill health. I want to compare and contrast two paradigms for obesity. I'll be relying on some work by a number of authors. David Ludwig, these are useful papers. The amiable Robert Lustig as well. And I'm particularly fond of the journalistic work of Gary Taubes. So let's start with the energy balance model. This is the dominant paradigm behind dietary advice given to children. And what it says is that obesity arises because we eat too much calories, and that puts us into positive energy balance, and so we shunt that excess energy into fat cells. And that's how we get fat. So this is a paradigm that says eat less and exercise more. And it's eat less calories because a calorie is a calorie. This is the paradigm behind the Australian dietary guidelines that emphasise things like choose the right amount of food to meet your energy needs and have mostly low-fat things. And if you actually zoom in on that bottom wedge with all of the dairy stuff, it's all low fat. So the issue, the paradigm here is reduce calories. I think that's the wrong paradigm for thinking about Mali. I prefer the carbohydrate insulin model, which says that a high glycemic load diet results in elevated insulin, and that elevated insulin partitions energy into fat stores. That leaves us with low circulating fuels, and we therefore compensate by eating more and by lowering our energy expenditure, and that puts us into positive energy balance. And so the positive energy balance is an outcome of a physiological state rather than a cause of the obesity. So I'm going to just review some of the physiology of insulin, and while I'm doing this, I want you to keep Mali in mind and remember that this 6-year-old girl lives in a persistent state of high insulin. And just think about what insulin is doing to her. So as we know, it's secreted in response to elevated blood glucose after a carbohydrate meal. And the thing that we all know that it does is it increases glucose uptake in liver, muscle, and fat cells. This is what that looks like in muscle and fat. Insulin drives the translocation of GLUT4 transporter, and glucose is brought into the cell, and then it's phosphorylated, which keeps it in the cell. It's a little bit different in the liver. In the liver, glucose uptake is by GLUT2, which is insulin independent, but insulin upregulates glucokinase, the enzyme that does this phosphorylation, and therefore keeps insulin in the cell. Either way, insulin drives the uptake of glucose. It also increases glucose utilization. That includes replenishing glycogen in liver and muscle cells. So this is the production of glycogen, but the problem with glycogen is that we can only store so much of it, and so glycogen inhibits its own generation. And so for a lot of people today, they've always got full glycogen stores, and so this pathway is chronically suppressed. So the other pathway is to actually continue to metabolize glucose. This is the glycolysis pathway, and there are multiple steps at which insulin upregulates this pathway. But there are also negative feedback loops. Up the top you can see this enzyme in the top right, phosphofructokinase, is the major regulatory step in the pathway, and it's inhibited by ATP. So when the cell has abundant energy stores, this pathway is downregulated, but it's upregulated by a lot of insulin as well. I'm going to come back to that. Glucose also downregulates gluconeogenesis in liver cells. So gluconeogenesis is the liver producing glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like protein and fat. So this is using pyruvate, which in the previous slide was the end product of glycolysis. But there are several pathways to glycolysis. So we're inhibiting gluconeogenesis in the context of a fed state. There's no reason for the liver to be providing additional glucose to the body. Insulin also upregulates de novo lipogenesis in liver and fat cells. That makes sense. We've got abundant energy. We need to store it, especially if we can't be storing it as glycogen because our glycogen stores are full. It also increases VLDL, very low-density lipoprotein, packaging and secretion by liver cells. So I'll show that in two steps. So the other thing that we can do with pyruvate in the mitochondria is convert it into acetyl-CoA. That can feed into the citric acid cycle here to provide energy for the cell, so in this case the liver cell. But the TCA cycle is also inhibited by ATP. So when the cell has sufficient energy, it doesn't need to produce more, and so it inhibits its own action. So that leads to a buildup of citrate. So what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to turn it into fat. It all makes sense. This is very logical. And citrate itself, when it builds up, it upregulates the production of fat. That makes sense. We've got to put it somewhere. And insulin upregulates the production of fat as well. And that fat can either be stored as a lipid droplet in the liver, or it can be packaged as VLDL and exported for storage elsewhere in the body, such as in fat cells. In fat cells, insulin upregulates fatty acid uptake from that VLDL, and that's through upregulating the expression of lipoprotein lipase. And so the fatty acids are taken up by the fat cell and stored in the form of triglycerides in these lipid droplets. And lastly, insulin downregulates fatty acid oxidation, because if we've got lots of glucose around, we should be burning the glucose rather than burning fat. So remember Marley, she's persistently in this state. So how is Marley going to lose weight? If we're in an energy balance model and we just tell her to eat less and exercise more, and she's in a high insulin state, that's going to be hard. And indeed, if you talk to Marley, she will tell you that she's persistently hungry. She never feels full, no matter how much she eats. She's 6. That's really sad. All right, so just to summarise, this is in the insulin-sensitive state, so probably most of us today. What does insulin do? In the liver, it increases the uptake and utilisation of glucose, and even more so in fat cells. Downregulates gluconeogenesis in the liver, and it upregulates the production of fat in both liver and fat cells. Increases lipid export by the liver and uptake by the fat cells. But what happens in insulin resistance is really interesting, because insulin resistance happens in the liver first, and it doesn't happen across the board. So at least in early insulin resistance, what happens is that the way that the liver manages glucose changes so that the liver starts to produce glucose again by gluconeogenesis, and it decreases its uptake of glucose. But the effect on the lipid pathways, at least at the start, are relatively maintained. Fat cells remain insulin sensitive for much longer. So this is a really bad place to be in, because now you've got glucose coming in from the thing that you just ate, and your liver producing glucose, and your fat cells still thinking that their job is to take it all up. So I think that I suspect that this correlates with a phenomenon that I often see of very significantly accelerated weight gain in kids of, something on the order of 2 kilos a month. This is not good. So I hope it's clear that the point here is that obesity in these kids is not a disorder of energy balance, it's a disorder of energy sensing and energy partitioning. And my hope today is that I'll convince everyone watching that our approach should be to address the root cause, the insulin resistance, rather than telling our kids to eat less and exercise more. So just to summarise some of what we know that low and very low carbohydrate diets for adults with type 2 diabetes can put them into remission without significant adverse consequences. So we know that it's possible. And we know that it can be very effective in the approach to both diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. But this isn't just something that you do once and it fixes the problem, because if they go back to eating a sad diet, it all comes back. We also know that it can be done in kids. And this study showed some positive results, and that there is increasing, although at this point still tepid, support for a low carbohydrate approach in young people. I want to make a small digression to talk about something that I think is really important but not prominent in just the basic carbohydrate insulin model, which is the role of fructose. So what's fructose? Well, fructose is half of sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. And when we eat sucrose, whether that's in the form of sugar or sugar-sweetened beverages, that disaccharide is broken very quickly into glucose and fructose by this enzyme sucrase in our gastrointestinal system. So just to review, the glucose bit goes all over the body, and glucose is used by cells all over the body, but some of it goes to the liver and it follows this pathway, and as I pointed out before, there are key regulatory points, including, importantly, the phosphofructokinase, such that when the liver is in a fed state, it uses less glucose. Fructose, not so much. So fructose is really only used by the liver, because only the liver has the GLUT5 transporter that transports it. And the GLUT5 transporter is highly efficient. And so fructose enters the liver cell after a fructose meal exceedingly quickly. Fructose is again phosphorylated into fructose 1-phosphate, and that is an exceptionally efficient enzyme. And so very quickly the liver cell becomes overwhelmed with fructose. And you'll notice again that our regulatory step is not there. So the metabolism of fructose in the liver occurs very quickly and does not have significant negative feedback loops. And so it follows, fructose can follow a number of pathways. We can end up with lots and lots of pyruvate, which can be used for fatty acid synthesis, or it can actually be metabolized into glycerol, which can participate in the synthesis of triglycerides. And at multiple points, fructose upregulates de novo lipogenesis. And so we know that it bypasses regulatory points and that it increases de novo lipogenesis, and especially in the presence of insulin, such as when fructose is co-ingested with glucose, i.e. sugar. So what do we know? Well, we know that fructose has a significant role in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and in fact, the pathogenesis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is similar to the pathogenesis of alcoholic fatty liver disease because histologically they're indistinguishable. But the metabolism of fructose is quite similar to the metabolism of alcohol in the liver. We know that kids who eat a lot of fructose get more liver disease. And these are just some useful papers. But we also know that when you restrict the intake of fructose, the indicators of metabolic syndrome improve. So fructose drives the development of fatty liver disease, and fatty liver disease drives insulin resistance. This is a great review article. I highly recommend reviewing this by Robert Lustig. So I talked about complexity before, and in my work I'm constantly faced with scenarios where I cannot tell the direction of causality. And so I need to move forward in that space of uncertainty. And I think this reflects the way that I feel when I look at nutritional literature, because so much of that is observational, where we cannot discern the direction of causality. We've actually just got to get on and do something. So, thinking about Mali again, how should I move forward? What should be my priority? My priority is going to be to treat the head lice because that's just kind. But at what point should I treat the metabolic stuff? Should I treat it? I'm a developmental paediatrician. Should I send her to a specialist? Who would that be? Well, I think that I need an approach, and we need an approach that allows us to do all of these things at once. And that's tricky because for me, this is not going to be a one-off appointment. This is going to be part of longitudinal care. I'm going to dance with this complexity, and we're going to we're going to engage in a mutual experience of sense-making and of helping this kid function better. So I have a 3-step framework for moving forward with metabolic action in the space of complexity. I want to talk to you about it today, but I want to start by highlighting what I need a framework like this to do. It needs to give me a clue at any point as to what my next action should be. I need to be able to build understanding and competence at a family level. I'm not going to ask this kid to do anything that I'm not also going to ask the whole family to do. I need it to give me a clear direction, and I want a vector rather than an imagined ideal. Because the reality of the world is that I'm not going to get all of my patients to an ideal state, but I just need to keep them moving in a good direction. It must not imperil the therapeutic relationship. So we're talking kids. I don't want frequent blood tests and I don't want drug side effects. Because if they stop seeing me, then I can't help them. And it must be fail-safe. I want to sit here for a little bit. Fail-safe means that when they fall off the wagon, they fall to something that's at least better than where they were, okay? So I don't want, when stress builds up again, because this is a high-stress family environment, when they forget to pay the electricity bill and the power goes out, I don't want them to default back to KFC. I want them to default to something just a little bit worse than when they were at. So fail-safe. So I start with the low-hanging fruit, the low-hanging bottled fruit. So that means sugar, that means fructose. It means I advocate abstinence from sugar-sweetened beverages for the whole family. And I think that it doesn't make any sense for me to proceed beyond this point while ever there is juice and Coke in the fridge. I won't, because it doesn't make sense. And I aggressively cut sugary snacks. We'll get to that in a minute. The next step is to simply improve the quality of the carbohydrates, and that means reduce the glycemic index and increase fibre. Because if they leave my care, this is still a better diet than they started with. Then I might reduce glycemic load. And this is the low carb bit. The glycemic load really matters. I start with dinner. I start with dinner for a few reasons. Breakfast is hard because breakfast is carbs, and a low carb breakfast takes more work. It's much easier to turn dinner into a low carb dinner, and it also maximizes the time between carbohydrate meals. They're going from probably lunch to breakfast. So by stretching out that carbohydrate fast, I'm increasing metabolic flexibility, building fat adaptation, and setting the groundworks for future ketogenic or intermittent fasting approach. I'm not going to do that for a 6-year-old, but I want to set the groundwork so that if we do need to move in that direction, it's easier. And I'm going to be teaching this to the parents as well. And so I might be advocating intermittent fasting or a very low carb approach for them. So that's all well and good for me to say, but as I said, I work in very disadvantaged communities with families who are under enormous stress and who often have the power shut off because they couldn't afford to pay the power bill. So it would be very disingenuous of me to say that with the best of advice, my families can do this. That's not the case. This stuff is cheap, but it's also really convenient. It doesn't require any forethought, meal prep. You can buy it now, chuck it in the cupboard. It's still there in 6-12 months' time. It's still more or less the same. And you don't. The kids can just go and get it out and open it themselves and feed themselves. So it's cheap at Coles, but it's also cheap in terms of time and energy, and that really matters. Contrast that with what I like to eat, which is this stuff, which is more expensive but takes a lot more forethought, planning, and if the power goes out and the fridge goes off, this is a problem. So we need to talk advocacy. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make here today is that a low-carb approach is all well and good, but if it's only accessible to the people in the leafy suburbs for whom life is comparatively easy, then we've failed the most vulnerable people in our community. This is Dr. David McDonald. He was my paediatrician. I grew up in Port Macquarie. He's a good bloke. A few years ago, McDonald's was going to put a restaurant in this location, which was right next to some very large schools. And so David McDonald took on McDonald's. Couldn't have picked it better, could you? And it was successful. And that restaurant did not go ahead. So that was really heroic. And I think this is the work that I think that we're called to, because we have the ability to speak with an authoritative voice. So we need to be doing this sort of thing. So take-home points. Don't be reassured by normal fasting glucose and HbA1c in children. It is an extremely lagging marker of metabolic ill health. Testing insulin levels is not straightforward because there are a number of assays and they are not standardized, but it is important. Focus on the metabolic health, and for me that means insulin sensitivity. Because while ever the child is insulin resistant, running more is not going to make them lose weight, it's going to make them more miserable. Fructose is toxic. I'll stand by that. And prevention is much better than cure. Thank you very much.